everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. I've changed the name of my channel to reflect the content that I post. I've felt for quite a while now that the Medieval Reader is a bit deceptive as a name for my channel, since I tend to post on literature in different time periods, not simply in the Middle Ages. And actually, my research now is predominantly in the 16th century, the Renaissance. So for me to say that I'm the medieval reader, while I do like medieval literature, I think that title is a bit deceptive. So I think the Francophile reader really reflects me more. I'd like to thank everybody. There were two people in particular who suggested this, and I think it's a really good name, so thank you. Today I would like to talk about a work of theory, particularly postcolonial theory, and this was inspired by Peau Noire, Masque Blanc by Frantz, Fanon. This is translated into English as Black Skin, White Masks. That's the literal translation, and that is the English title. This is definitely a book to start with if you're just getting into critical race theory. Or post-colonial studies. This is very concise. It's only a little over 200 pages. It's made up of different essays dealing with colorism, black-white race relations, just a number of topics that remain very relevant. So Frantz Fanon was from Martinique, which is a territory of France, and he wrote this in the 1950s. So I want to kind of give an overview of the major topics that he discusses so that you get an introduction to Fanon. Now, one of the things that's a bit difficult to kind of get into today is Fanon's use of psychoanalytic theory. Now, he is generally quite critical of psychoanalysis, because as you will see, a lot of the scholars whose work he's criticizing are psychoanalysts who are basically blaming the struggles that Black people experience in their relation to white people and the way that that leads to self-loathing, and that this is a huge topic that Fanon discusses. A lot of psychoanalysts in the 50s and earlier were attributing that to the nature of Black people. So one of the things that psychoanalysis was doing was, in addition to it being sexist, was also racist. And then you see this over and over again in this work, that psychoanalysis basically blames Black people for everything by saying, oh, it's part of their nature too. So I mean, just essentializing this feeling of inferiority, when in fact, of course, this is a product of a racist culture. Be that as it may, there are still some arguments in here that require some knowledge of psychoanalysis, which I don't really have, and sometimes it gets a little bit difficult for me to accept because I just don't accept psychoanalysis as true. It's been largely discredited in the psychology world. So the first thing to note is that Fanon is not interested in the past for past's sake, and he's not interested in the future. He's interested in the now. He's interested in the present. And he says that, a lot of times people will talk about, what we should do for Black people in the future. And he's like, no, I'm not concerned about that. I mean, of course I am, but I'm concerned about Black people today because I'm living now. That is what matters. And that also goes along with his conviction that we are all products of our present time, about the kinds of structures that exist today. And that is what he's addressing. Now, his today is the 1950s, so we have to think about to what degree this still applies today, 2019, almost 2020. So the first thing he says is that when we speak, we are reflecting a culture. Language is understood as a cultural product, because this becomes important when he comes to analyze the way that Black people speak about themselves, the way that white people speak about Black people, etc. Now, in Martinique, this is also applied to education, and this understanding that to speak well means that you speak as a white person. And he talks about how in Martinique, at the time, this was an expression to parler comme un blanc, to speak like a white person. And so as a result, you have these people from Martinique who will move to the mainland in France, the métropole, and they will go to university, they will learn how to speak as a white person, and then they will come back and they will have forgotten how to speak Creole. They will basically only speak as white people do in France. And so inevitably they alienate other people in Martinique, but also it creates this tension between, you know, these people who are educated in Europe who think that now they have become white because they can speak in this way, when in fact they haven't. And this is what he gets into, is that they put all this effort into speaking well and conforming to white standards, and they never really succeed because they aren't white. And that creates this real disappointment. We're talking about self-loathing and how self-loathing is a product of a culture that values and celebrates whiteness, so that Black people also value and celebrate whiteness and try to attain it. He does talk about colorism, how darker skinned Black people are of an inferior status than lighter skinned Black people. He's addressing this phenomenon of people who have been oppressed really believing in this oppression and how destructive and damaging that is. And there's this really interesting case where people in the Antilles, because they might be lighter skinned, because of their proximity to whiteness, Martinique, for example, being a territory of France, they start to distinguish themselves from Black people in Africa, and they actually understand themselves as being white. So there's that too, where you have people who are perceived as Black by white Europeans, but then not understanding themselves as Black, and that Black people are those who live in Africa. And so then there's this animosity towards Black people in Africa. Like, for example, they talk about the Senegalese, the man from Senegal, who is perceived as the bad Black person. And, you know, the man from Martinique saying, oh, I'm not this person, they're the bad person. And not, you know, the irony of that actually, through the white gaze, there is no difference. And it's really another tragedy that, you know, going to France again, this man from Martinique who is educated in the French system, who's highly, highly educated, has all the degrees in the world, finds that he's not being respected much more than he was before. Because ultimately, this isn't a question of intelligence, it's a question of physicality. That Black people, particularly Black men, are villainized because they're seen as overly sexual. At one point, Fanon says that to say rape, to even mention rape, is to already evoke the image of a Black man. He's describing the psychological effect of this racism and how this psychological effect is a product of society. It is not some inborn thing. You get to see what was passed off as sound scholarship, as sound psychology in the first half of the 20th century. And it's shocking. I think that, you know, thinking about how, and we see this still a little bit, there will be these studies that suggest that certain races are more intelligent than others, and they'll pass them off as scientific. This has been going on for a while. I mean, it is eugenics. It's more rare, but occasionally there will be an article about that, and it's always a cause for concern. He talks about representation. He says, you know, you wonder why these children have this constant desire to be white. It's not because Black people just naturally want to be white. It's because from a very young age, literally the only thing they see in popular culture being celebrated is a white person. So that's the standard. That is the standard of excellence. That's the standard of goodness. That's the standard of purity. You know, for something to be pure, it's white. White becomes this image of purity, and Black is this image of demons and darkness and like filth. And so when a child is raised with this binary, that's going to affect them. They're going to constantly, want to attain this white status. Another quote that really stuck out to me, I'll read in French. L'inconscient collectif n'est pas dépendant d'un héritage cérébral. Il est la conséquence de ce que j'appellerais l'imposition culturelle irréfléchie. So the collective unconscious is not dependent on a cerebral heritage, an intellectual heritage. It is the consequence of what I will call an unreflective cultural imposition. That, I think, is a great quote to end this book with. Yeah, so I think that if you are getting into critical race studies, postcolonial studies, I definitely recommend Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. It is a classic, and I am really glad that I read it for Nonfiction November. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.